Okay. So got a lot of fun stuff going on today. We've been working with Python throughout this cohort. I've been working with SQL in this past week. Today, we are going to combine Python and SQL together, Postgres and Python. The way we're going to do this is we're going to use a library called Psycopg. It's a Python library that lets us interact with Postgres.
So Raphael, there's still 5 people in a breakout room if you want to close that down.
Oh yeah, let's
shut it down. Shut it down.
We go through an entire lecture, we're just missing everyone.
Yeah, I can't close them immediately. It's going to take a minute for them to get kicked out. I might just pop in there real quick.
It's like, how long can you do career prep for?
Right. Actually, I don't think I can join a breakout room while I'm presenting. Hang on just a second.
Like the breakout rooms are becoming like the room, like in the
Okay, I think we actually have everyone now. Okay, so we're going to use the Psycopg library. To create databases and insert data, just like what we've been doing with SQL at the command line. We're going to be doing this from a Python library. We're going to understand parameterized queries. I think someone was asking about this or something related to this the other day, including what SQL injection is and how we can avoid it. We're going to learn a little bit about transactions. Remind me, did you cover database transactions at all during the workshop on Tuesday? I can't recall.
I think we talked about them existing and kind of briefly went over some ways we might use them, but we didn't do any practical implementation or anything.
Okay, so we're going to use them today. And then lastly, we're going to be working a little bit more with CSV files. I know we just can't get away from it. We're going to read and clean data from a CSV to insert into a Postgres database. This is honestly a fairly common problem. You'll get data from non-technical people in a CSV file, and the data is sloppy or just invalid for some reason, and you need to automatically kind of clean it up, convert it into the format you need before you can insert it into the database. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. All right. So as I've been saying, we've been spending the past 3 days just learning about SQL using Postgres. We've learned how to create, read, update, and destroy databases, columns, database rows, all the fundamental things in our database. So this is pretty fundamental to all programming. Doesn't matter if you're doing front end, back end, server, mobile, anything. Data is pretty important, and basically any application is going to be backed up by a database. So no matter what branch of programming you get into after this bootcamp, solid understanding of SQL is going to be really useful to you in your career. So normally, though, you're not just writing raw SQL like at the command line or executing SQL files. You're going to be using SQL in the context of some other programming language. So today, it's Python and Postgres using this library, Psycopg. So in order to demonstrate that, I've created a folder here. I imaginatively called it Psycho. And then I'm going to install this library so we can start trying it out. Got a terminal over here. So first, I'm going to need to activate my virtual environment because I'm going to install a new library, and I want to make sure that different projects might need different versions of this library. So I need to keep that segregated from my other projects with a virtual environment. I've already created it last night, so I'm just going to activate it right now. All right, so now my virtual environment is activated. Now we can use pip to install Psycopg. I've already done this, so this should be pretty fast on my machine, but when you do it, it'll actually take a minute. So yeah, it's telling me that this has already been installed to this virtual environment because I did that last night, but you all will be installing it fresh. All right, so now I'm going to create a database. I'm going to create a database for a class roster. Imagine like we're building a school here. And I'm actually going to do this really quick at the command line. And then we're going to connect to an existing database from within our code. It's not as common that you create databases inside of the code. Generally, they'll exist already. And then from Python, we'll connect to this existing database. So I'm going to use the create DB command. You've already seen this, shouldn't be a surprise. Just so I can create a database without actually logging in and logging out of Postgres. So I already created this database last night. It already exists. Actually, why don't we okay, so I just dropped the class roster database. So now we can actually create it fresh. Create database class roster. Cool. So now that I have created a database, I've installed the Psycopg library that I'm using to interact with my database. Let's just start writing some code. Jesse, question?
Yeah, real quick, because we're in the virtual environment, does the by creating your new one, a new database, does that is it really connected, or is it kind of totally still separate, just like anything else you do with the database?
Right. The database that I just created is not connected to my virtual environment. Only the Python modules that I install are specific to the virtual environment. So just this Psycopg module is specific to that virtual environment. And today, that's the only third-party module I'll be installing. So nothing else that I do today is specific to my virtual environment, except the fact that I installed this one library. Because yeah, I can exit out of my virtual environment and still connect to the same databases that I'm creating now.
Perfect, thank you.
Yep. So we import Psycopg. Now to connect to our database, we're going to create a connection object. We call psycopg.connect. Let me just change this real quick here. Okay. And so then we pass in a connection string. This is pretty similar to how you connect at the command line. Postgres is going to correctly assume most of the connection information, like the port is the default port. The username is the default username. It's just going to take that from my user account. The only thing I actually need to specify here in this case is the DB name, class roster. So that's what I'm putting into the connect statement. I'm going to add one other thing here. We'll explain this later, but this is going to make our demo a little bit simpler starting out. Don't worry about that right now. We'll explain that shortly. All right, so now to create a database, this is going to be a fairly large query. So I'm just going to assign the query itself to a variable and then pass it in to the execute method later. All right, so that looks like a decent create table query. So now I'm going to actually run this with connection.execute student table creation query. And then lastly, I'm going to call connection.close. So it's important to remember that the database can only support a limited number of simultaneous connections. So when you're done using it, it's important to close the connection. This isn't going to be as relevant for just this little command line program that we're doing. But if you were building like a bigger application that accepted requests from users over the internet and could potentially make multiple connections to the database, you need to make sure to close those connections so you don't run out of connections. I saw a few hands go up.
Hey, Raphael. Question. So psycopg.connect is I guess I'm trying to conceptualize what's happening when you do connection.execute. So is that a function inside of psycopg.connect?
I'm sorry, can you say that one more time?
Like so you made the variable connection just basically as like an alias for this command here, psycopg.connect, and then the DB name and then auto commit false. So when you do .execute on that, that's a function inside of where that you're calling?
So that's a function on the connection itself. So I wouldn't say that this is an alias here. When I call psycopg.connect, I'm calling this function here and it returns a new object that it creates, which represents a single connection to the database. And so using this single connection, I can then run SQL statements.
Gotcha. So each time you call that, it's making a connection. And then you're telling the connection what to do.
Right. So as you'll see later in this demo, I'm just going to call connect once at the top of the script, and then I'll call execute multiple times for every query that I want to run.
Gotcha. But when you do a connection.execute, isn't that using that connection variable and calling connect again?
I'm not reconnecting. I'm just reusing the existing connection.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
Someone else raised their hand, I think.
Yeah, just for clarity, you can only run psycopg when you're in the virtual environment because it's installed to your virtual one. But anything it does is saved to the database, which is still accessible even if you're not in the virtual environment, right?
Correct. Except, I mean, technically you can run psycopg without a virtual environment, but you shouldn't. But I think you got the right idea that like everything that you're creating in the database here is not connected to your virtual environment.
Okay, awesome.
So anyways, I'm connecting the database, running a query to create a table, closing the connection. So let's just see if this works so far. Just going to run this Python file. So it didn't give me any output. So at least it didn't fail. So I'm going to open up a new tab to open pSQL so we can look in the database and see if this table exists. So I'm able to enter my class roster database that was created successfully. Wait a second. Okay, there we go. So this option that I've not yet explained to you was set incorrectly. I'll explain later what that does. But so now we can see that we've created this table, this query ran successfully. When I look at it in pSQL, you can see I've got our students table. If we describe students,
Raphael, sorry to interrupt. I'm just trying to follow along. I think I missed a couple commands. Could you scroll up in your terminal for me?
Over here,
How did you activate Psycopg in the terminal?
Pardon?
How did you activate Psycopg in the terminal?
So what do you mean? Like, this is just my virtual environment that's just activated.
Oh, my mistake.
Yeah. I mean, so that was just
Yeah, okay.
source. Yeah, I just named it similarly to the tool we're using.
My mistake, that just threw me off.
No worries. Sorry if that was confusing. But yeah, Psycopg is not being used at the terminal. It's only being used from my code. Jesse?
Yeah, the question I have is on the query on line 5, because as far as visual wise, I know when we write it in SQL, it's not all one line. Are we doing something similar with this, or are we wanting to still use a SQL file to work with queries in Python? I don't know if that makes any sense.
I mean, you wouldn't use a SQL file, I would say, but there are other ways that you can write this. So if legibility is important, which it is, this is probably how I would write this query more.
Okay, yeah, okay, that makes more sense to me. Okay.
Cool.
That triple quote, are those considered like doc strings or?
They're used for that often. In a generic sense, the triple quote in Python is kind of similar to the backtick string in JavaScript in that it allows multi-line strings. So that's the only reason why I'm using it here, is because it lets me have multi-line strings. If this was just regular quotation marks, I wouldn't be able to break this across multiple lines. But in order to preserve the indentation for my string, I have to use the triple quotes.
Got it.
Mm-hmm. Were there any other questions, or should we continue?
I have a quick question. I'm looking at the curriculum page, and after the connect in the parentheses, it has an F. Is that not necessary?
So in this case, it's not necessary because, or I'm sorry, were you looking at the query or the connection string here?
The one you have highlighted, yeah, that.
Okay, yeah. So in this case, it's not necessary because we're just hard coding all the data in. We're not interpolating any variables. I think in the curriculum document, there was originally a variable being interpolated in there. So that's why it's using the format string, but it's not necessary in that case. Later on, though, we'll see some queries that have variables interpolated into them. And so we'll be briefly using the format strings later on.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay, so I'm going to be running through this script a few times, running through different versions of it. And just to make sure that we're starting fresh every time, I'm going to actually drop this students table before we create it, just so that every time I run the script, we're creating the students table and doing everything fresh.
Hey, Raphael, I have a question.
Let's hear it.
So I try to import Psycopg, but it only lets me import Psycopg2. I don't know if that's going to cause more issues.
That's definitely going to cause issues. This demo will 100% not work in Psycopg2.
Okay.
Yeah, there are a few like shortcuts and conveniences that I'm using here to make the demo a little bit more streamlined. So there's kind of some extra hoops you'd have to jump through if you're using Psycopg2.
Okay.
If you just do pip install, it should get the latest version. You might need to update pip. I'm not sure.
Oh, okay. So just pip install Psycopg and it should, is this one Psycopg3 or is this 2 the one you're using?
This is Psycopg3 that I'm using, but I didn't specify the number. I just typed in Psycopg and it got me the latest version.
Okay, I'll try to update pip, see if that does anything.
Okay. All right, so if the students table already exists when the script starts, we're going to drop it, and then we're going to go ahead and create it. Now I'm going to run a query to insert some data. All right, pretty standard insert statement. We're going to add a student with a favorite food. So I've just run this script again. We'll go to pSQL and take a look. So we do have our students table. If I select star from students, and it shows me that one record that we just inserted, Alice, who loves cake. But so what I've done here is not the most useful or elegant way that I could write a SQL statement in my code, because I've hard coded these values here for the name and the favorite food. So what really makes interacting with SQL from a programming language powerful is the fact that we can interpolate variables into our query string. We don't have to just hard code them. So if variables are coming out of like an API or a database or a user request, we can put those variables inside of our SQL query string. So let's look at a different query that uses some variable interpolation. Got Bob now, he loves lemons. Okay, so now I've written another similar SQL statement, except here, the variables are not just hard-coded in as part of the query string, but I'm using Python's variable interpolation, using the format strings to insert some data based on my Python variables. So this does work. I'm going to show you in a second, but this is actually pretty terrible what I've just done. So don't pay too close attention to the exact code on the screen. So I run this Python main.py, no errors, check from pSQL. We do have two students now. Got Alice who loves cake, Bob who loves lemons, but there is a big problem with what I've just done here. Andrew, can you tell me what the huge problem is?
Is that the quotation marks?
How do you mean?
I think I remembered like just putting values into your SQL table. Like you normally do like one quotation mark. And so Alice is in there with just like a string with one quotation mark. But what you really have right now is like singular quotation mark and then inside of that double quotation mark. So it might be interpolating it differently.
I don't know. It
mean,
looks right in the database, doesn't it?
It looks right, but it might be in there as something else, I think.
Maybe. I think it's okay though. I think we got our quotes right. It just looks a little bit weird because we're interpolating a string into a string, and like here the quotes are just to say this is a string in Python. But here these quotes are part of the SQL syntax. So it's a little hard to read, but I think the quotes are fine. John, do you have a thought? Do you have a suggestion?
SQL injection.
Yeah. So this here is a SQL injection vulnerability. So the problem here is that a clever user might submit a value for name that has SQL code in it. And so then when that code gets interpolated into this statement, it just gets executed as, you know, one complete SQL statement. And then it might accidentally run the code that you inserted for name. So I'm going to show you real quick what that looks like, just so you understand, you know, why this is something you need to be very careful of. Anytime you're taking untrusted input from a user, or yeah, anytime you're letting a user type in data that gets fed into a SQL statement later, you need to be very careful about how that is handled. We got another person, Mallory. Her favorite food is pizza. Actually, her name is not Mallory. Her name is Mallory, quotation mark, comma, apples, quotation mark, and parenthesis, semicolon, drop table students. So yeah, that's Mallory's actual name. Oh yeah, and then just the same execute statement. So I'll just copy and paste that down there. So I feel like we've already given it away, but what do we think is going to happen when this statement gets run, and why?
I'll go ahead and pipe up. So whenever you interpolate in the name, it's gonna end because of the semicolon for that query. Then it's going to start another one that drops a table, and then anything else that the interpolation has will be counted out because of the double tick mark.
That's right. So when Python goes to interpolate name into this space here, you know, after we have this open parenthesis and this open quotation mark, her name includes the end of a SQL query. You know, it's got this end parenthesis and a semicolon, and then an entire other SQL query here. So for this reason, many libraries that you might use to run SQL queries will only let you run one query at a time, just because generally when you're running two queries in a single execution, it's probably someone trying to inject code and hack you. There aren't really a lot of practical reasons why you need to do that. So yeah, and then there's this entire other query that drops the table students. And then this double dash is an inline comment in SQL. So that just ignores the rest of the query so that it's valid SQL code. This is how you actually exploit a vulnerability. So let's just run this just for funsies. Still don't get any errors because this is all valid SQL. When I go back to pSQL, select star from students, where did my students go? It's not even an empty table. The table just doesn't even exist. So that's because I just got pwned. Somebody injected SQL code into my application and we executed it accidentally. So that's really bad. So in fact, this is such a famous vulnerability. There's a webcomic that describes this. You may have read this before. It's pretty famous. Give you 2 seconds to read it. I think this is pretty funny, even though this is like 10 years old or something at this point. It's not a new comic. I guess this is one of the oldest like web security vulnerabilities too, though. Anyways, I'm going to assume everyone's laughing. Just have your microphone off, so that's great. So now let me show you actually the proper way that you're supposed to insert parameters into your queries. Okay, so now I'm using slightly different syntax for execute. Hang on. Okay, that looks correct. So yeah, using a slightly different syntax for execute. Now it's taking 2 arguments. First, it's taking the query itself, but you'll note that the actual values are not included. I'm using this placeholder %s. And then as a second argument, I pass in a tuple, which has the actual values that are used in the placeholders. So then as either a tuple or a list, you can pass in the data you need in order as the second argument. So note that the order matters here. If I pass these in as food, name, then we would have a woman named Tuna, whose favorite food is Carol. And so that would be incorrect.
Stay away from that tin fish.
Yes, exactly. So I'm going to run that real quick. Make sure that actually works successfully. Cool, no errors there. And now we have Carol. Let's see. So I don't want to just be viewing all the results from pSQL every time. It would be nice if we could, use Python then to query our data and view the results. So I'm just going to put a quick little query at the bottom here. So real simple query, select star from students. But after we call connection.execute, we're assigning that to a variable. This is going to store all of our results. And then if I want to look at them, I'm just going to print results.fetch all. So now this is what our database looks like when we get it out of Python. Because Python doesn't naturally have tables as a data type, so it's giving us everything as a tuple. Just all the columns we selected are here in order. So it's the ID, the name, and the food for each of the users in our tuple here. And it's all enclosed in one list. So we've got a list of tuples as the data format that we get out of Postgres. All right, but now there's one more thing I want to show you about parameterized queries. So honestly, personally, I don't like this syntax very much, just using the %s, because they're ordered parameters. So we've seen this pattern come up in a lot of other places where as you're providing data to some function or whatever, excuse me, you often have the choice between ordered parameters and named parameters. You know, we've seen this in Python with keyword arguments versus the regular positional arguments. Saw this in URLs with the named query string variables versus the positional URL parameters. So we're going to do kind of the same thing here. I don't like using these positional parameters because in a bigger SQL query, you might have lots of these. Like the query might be a half a page or a full page of code, and you could have, you know, dozens of variables. And sometimes you'll have the same variable inserted in multiple different places in the same query. So imagine if that's the case, you know, not only are you going to have dozens of variables here, but you might have the same variable listed multiple times because you have to just list them all in order that they're used in the query. So I strongly prefer using named arguments for my SQL queries. This is, you know, an option that you have. You don't have to do this, but in my opinion, like the serious kinds of SQL queries that people write professionally become illegible really fast if you're using these positional parameters. So I'm going to make another person. Call this guy Dan. Dan loves bagels.
And name parameters too, that doesn't, by doing that, it doesn't, you can do it in any order because it's named, right? They don't have
Correct.
to be in the same order.
Right, yeah, we're going to see that in just a second. I'll be able to just pass in a dictionary, which is not an ordered data type in Python. Okay, so here's our values array, our values list. Now, the way we're going to specify the placeholders now is still with a %s, but then in the middle of that, we're going to have some parentheses that have the name of our parameter. So I'm going to call this one name. And then again, another %s, and this one is food. You can see even, you know, my editor, for some reason, seems to understand that I'm writing SQL inside of Python, and it actually like colors these appropriately, which kind of surprises me. Usually when you write one language inside of another language, like your editor gets confused by that, but it looks like VS Code knows what I'm doing here. And then as the second argument after the query string, we're going to pass in a dictionary. It's going to have a name property, which is just equal to the name over here, Dan. And it's going to have a food property, which is just equal to the food bagels. All right, so now let's run that all. Cool, so it looks like everything was inserted successfully. Got Alice, Bob, Carol, and Dan. They got all the data that I expected them to have, but I was able to insert Dan using this more flexible syntax. So I think that's really great. This is how I would prefer to write all of my SQL queries generally. As you'll discover pretty soon though, Django is going to handle a lot of this kind of low-level detail work for you. So as you're working with Django, you're not going to have to be writing your queries like this using the name parameters. But in many other frameworks, you'd have to do that. And there will be some situations where you'll write raw SQL with Django. It's just not super common. But when you are writing a raw SQL in some programming language, this is how I prefer to do it. All right, so that's all I've got to say about query parameters. Next, I want to move on and talk about transactions in SQL. But first, I think it's a good time for questions and then a break. Who has got some questions? Sukhdev?
Hey, thanks. Just a couple. So this last method that you showed us, that's just because if we have multiple variables, it might be hard to keep track of their order. Is that why that second method of inserting via the dictionary and the names, we don't need to remember it's like order 5 or whatever else is pretty
Correct.
clear. Okay.
You're
Thank you.
more than welcome to use this syntax. I just find it very hard to read if you have more than like 4 or 5 parameters.
Okay, cool. That makes sense. And then there's 2 other questions. One, for whatever reason, when I'm following along, I have to use this connection.commit for it to work, but you're not seeming to use it. Is that auto commit true? Okay.
Yeah.
That's why.
So in the very next section in this lecture, I'm going to be turning off auto commit. So we're going to explore what that was doing for us, and we're going to handle that manually instead.
Okay, great. And then the last question, I had a hard time following that SQL injection vulnerability that we talked about. So for SQL, whenever we just have a closed parentheses with a colon, since the colon is the end of the command, it just goes to the next, and it goes to the next command. That's why I did it. It was because of the semicolon.
Right. So like, let me just show you right at P-SQL, I can be like, insert into students name values Steve, and then insert into students name values Jeff. And so it just runs 2 statements in one line because the semicolon separates statements. So this is not something that's like practically useful, but it's exploited by hackers to inject more SQL code into your database.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. We got some more hands up.
I had a question about fetch all. Is that Psychopg or is that Python functionality?
I mean, Psychopg is a Python library. It doesn't exist outside of Python. But yeah, this is specific to Psychopg interacting with your Postgres database to give you the actual results after you execute the query. Because you could potentially just get them row by row or get like a specific page of results, I believe.
Yeah, I tried it without the fetch all, and it like did that thing like when we were doing like OOP, like it just like showed like object tuple at this memory location.
Right.
And I was wondering, I was like, could I have just used the same thing in like OOP to just show it all like the same way?
I mean, it depends on what object you're trying to look at. Like some OOP class might have a repra or a string method defined for it that gives you a string representation of it. You know, in this case, the fetch all method was built in just to give you this list representation of the data. I guess that Psychopg doesn't want to assume what format you want the data in. So after you execute the query, you have to call some other method to specify how you want it back. Just because SQL data is not the same as Python data, you know, they have different data types. Does that help?
Yeah, that helps. Thanks.
Okay. Were there any other hands up? Jesse?
Yeah, I'm just kind of looking at the SQL injection a little bit more and seeing on line 27 to 30, when you're trying to change it with placeholders, if they messed around with the food element on line 28, like you did with the name on the SQL injection with the name with Carol, would that have any effect? Or, you know,
So
what, you see where I'm getting at with the vulnerabilities?
Yeah, it looks like you can still do a SQL injection. So in theory, the people who built Psycopg are smart and they're aware of SQL injection. And so this syntax here, where I use the placeholders with these variables, this is smarter than just the regular Python variable interpolation. So this does more than just insert a string into another string. But I believe Psycopg is actually doing some sanity checking on it to make sure that like you're only inserting one variable for each of those variables. You know what I'm saying? Like somehow Psycopg knows that this is a single query with two variables in it. And then after interpolating it, it needs to end up with a single query with two variables in it. If it ends up with two queries, then like something went wrong.
Got it. All right, that makes sense.
Mhm. Any more questions for the moment? No questions. Okay, let's take a 13-minute break now. Come back at 10:20, and we're going to start talking about transactions in SQL. Andrew, do you have a question?
I do. It's gonna bother me if I don't ask it. So the wildcard S there is like a variable for like you can put any string in there, right?
You can put any data in there.
So my question is this. So it kind of reminded me of like the wildcard operators when we like do the selects for like select wildcard S in the string thing. My question is this: can we insert into the data structure using like to have it search through like a dictionary and find values like something to insert in?
I mean, you could write Python code that does that, but I can't think of.
Yeah, that was what I was kind of thinking. I was like, because I know you could do like the Python like rejects through like the values of the dictionary, but I was wondering if like you could just do the opposite of like the selective like searching like that.
I'm not exactly sure. Having a little trouble visualizing what you're asking about, I think.
Yeah, just like if we had like a dictionary of like 100 million things, but we wanted, if there was like something built into like the PostgreSQL where like it can search through it sort of using like the like thing where it just searches like empty space S and then it only selectively inserts it into the table that way.
Maybe I can't think of anything simple off the top of my head that works like that. Sorry.
Yep.
Does anyone have any other questions before we start talking about transactions? Any questions? No questions? Okay. So how about this? Can anyone just tell me before I give my own definition of what a transaction is in SQL? Has anybody experienced these before, or we've heard about them a little bit?
I believe it's like a group of actions that are kind of like queued up to be taken at the same time.
Yeah. So a transaction is a group of SQL statements that all run together, not at the same time, you know, they do have to run one after another. But the important thing here is that if any of them fails, they'll all get reversed. So generally, in order to use transactions from inside of SQL, like if you're just running a SQL script, you would begin a transaction with begin transaction, does exactly what it sounds like. Then you run all of your queries within that transaction after the begin statement. run a whole bunch of related transactions that you need to succeed. And then when you're done, you can actually save them to the database with commit, just another SQL command. So this actually commits the transaction. However, if there's a problem anywhere, if something fails, so these are the three main parts of a transaction in SQL: begin transaction, commit, and rollback. Although, as we're going to see in using Psycopg here, we're not going to actually have to write these statements ourselves: begin transaction, commit, and rollback. Psycopg is going to do these for us, but we still have to have some understanding of what it's doing and when, so we can manage the transaction. So let's see, I think I'm gonna make a new file for this code. All right, so just copy and paste it over my previous code. I'm still going to connect to the class roster database, but this is going to have some account balances, maybe your lunch money balance or something. But now what I'm going to do is turn off auto commit true. So the way Psycopg works is that whenever you call connection.execute, it automatically starts a new transaction. So if I call connection.execute multiple times, those will all be part of the same transaction. The first time I call it, it creates a new transaction if we weren't already in one. But other than that, the execute statements will all be in the same transaction. Now, what was happening before is because I had auto commit true, is Psycopg would automatically commit every transaction as soon as it was executed. So we were not actually able to group any statements together because every individual statement was immediately committed to the database. So if we want to actually use transactions to group queries together and be able to have them succeed or fail together, I'm going to have to turn off auto commit here. Porky?
I just wanted to ask, does auto commit auto default to, if you didn't put that argument in there at all, it would just automatically default to false, right?
Correct. This should be the default behavior, what I'm showing you now. Apparently, the makers of Psycopg think that transactions are so important that the default behavior is not auto commit, so you're actually using real transactions. I just set auto commit to true for the first start of this demo to show you some other concepts a little bit more smoothly, a little more simply. But practically speaking, you'll always want to be using transactions. So let me just make an account real quick. Got the table for accounts. I'm gonna actually add a few. Okay, so I'm inserting one account called my account. Another one called your account. Has much less money. I'm sorry. And we're gonna insert that. Gonna fetch it all and take a look at it. So let's just make sure that that works so far. Run the account transactions file. Cool. So we've created two accounts. There's my account with $100 and your account with $0. So kind of the classic example of a situation where you need transactions is transferring money from one account to another. All right, so we've got two SQL statements here that logically these should go together. We are first decrementing $25 from my account, and then we're incrementing $25 to your account. If only one of these happens, then something really wrong has happened. And then, this doesn't make sense anymore. Because if I lose 25 without you gaining it, then, we just lost money. If you gained it without me losing it, then just money has appeared out of nowhere into our system. This needs to actually be a transfer. So if everything goes correctly, this can actually work. So I'm going to print out these results again. So we can see here the second time we fetch the accounts, my account is $75, yours is $25. So it looks like we were able to move that money. But what if there's a problem? What if we throw an error in between these two lines of code? So I'm just going to throw an exception here, or actually, throwing an exception, and I'm just going to turn auto commit back on for just a hot second here. So this is again going to show us what happens if we automatically commit every SQL statement after it's executed. So we're going to execute this first statement, throw an error, and then never execute the second statement. So throwing the error actually prevents us from logging the output and seeing the rest of it. But then if I just go to pSQL, something doesn't look right. My account only has $75 because we successfully ran this query, but your account hasn't gained anything because we threw an error before we're able to run that second query. So let me put auto commit back to false. And I'm going to show you kind of a more standard and reliable way that you can work with your transactions. So let's take out this error for a moment. So I'm going to wrap these statements in a try catch, just because, I'm thinking that there might be an error. This exception here may or may not happen. I don't know. If I want to just be prepared for it and wrap this code in a try except. So first we try to run these queries. And if they all work successfully, then we commit our transaction at the end. This is after we've done all the work that we need to do that has to be grouped together. If we get this far in our code, we assume it was successful. And so we commit the transaction. That is not the button I meant to type. Okay, so now in the try catch, seems like we're successfully decrementing for my account. Let's put this at the end here. Okay, but now if we throw an exception in our try catch block, and I'll run this again. So now we see something went wrong. Looks like it's rolling back to before I actually ran this program, because it's going back to 100 and, or it's going back to 75 and 25. It's not exactly what I was expecting, but the important part is that our database is not left in an inconsistent state. We haven't lost any money by doing this, or no one has gained money randomly, but using this try except. Yeah, just if anything goes wrong while we're trying to run these queries, then we can roll back the transaction and it just undoes everything that happened before.
So in this scenario, would a whole transaction be one file? Like one transaction be one file, that way that one file raises the exception before the start of the transaction?
The transaction would probably be smaller than one file. Like, maybe one function would be run entirely in a transaction, or just one block of code would be in a transaction. Like you might use multiple transactions over the course of a single request to your server. It just depends on how you need to group the SQL statements. Andrew?
Just making sure the connection rolls back. It rolls all the way back to when the connection is opened.
Right. So
It'll be all the way at the top then.
yeah, because I never explicitly say like start the transaction. It's just as soon as I start running these queries, these should all be part of this transaction.
Mhm.
So yeah, when I roll back, it rolls back to before I started writing any of this code, or before any of these executed. So yeah, I want to point out here that there are a couple of different reasons why we might get an exception in the try block. So here, I'm just manually throwing an error. We can imagine that like our Python code could throw an error, like if you try to access a property of a dictionary that doesn't exist, something like that. But also we're looking for errors to be thrown here if our database constraints are violated. So for example, let's say we say that account balance has to be a positive integer. And then let's say that this statement here, balance equals balance minus 25, like if I just started with 20 bucks and I try to decrement it by 25, that's going to leave my account in an invalid state because I have less than $0 then. So in that case, we would expect our database to throw an error. And then we would go into the accept block and then roll back our transaction to prevent us from inserting invalid data into the database. So yeah, there's a few different ways that things can go wrong, but in all those cases, you want to roll back the transaction. All right, people have any questions about this try except code? We're going to rewrite this in just a second to be a little bit more elegant.
Raphael, why does, when you do the results, why does it show that it actually, the 75 and 25 after the error message is printed in the console?
I believe it's because all of the SQL statements in this file are part of the same transaction. So when I roll it back, it actually reverts to the state that it was after the last time when I successfully ran the script. So the last time I successfully ran the script without rolling anything back, it ran both of these statements. So it successfully transferred the money. When I try to run the script again and through the exception and had to roll back, it did successfully create my account with $100 in it. But that transaction or that query got rolled back as well when we hit this rollback statement. So the database got reverted to how it was at the end of the previous time I ran the script. The last time it was run successfully.
So it goes to like the last commit, right? When you roll back?
Right. Yeah, when you roll back, everything that was done inside that transaction didn't happen. It gets undone. And then just whatever the state of the database was at your last commit, that's the state of your database then.
So if you moved, or if you just put a commit right before the try block to commit everything you'd done up to that point and then did the try block, would that work the way you were thinking, where it just bounce it back to the?
I think so. Okay, yeah. So because we committed now after the account setup, but before the transactions, when we roll back, we're seeing the account setup has taken a place. That I have my account with 100, your account with 0, and then it's just the transfer that gets undone. So yeah, I was able to take a little bit more control over how these transactions are working by committing before the account transfer, the balance transfer. And so then this connection.execute is creating a new transaction here. It's a good question, good observation. All right, so I'm going to move on a second. We're going to show a slightly more elegant way that we can write this code. Does anyone have any more questions though about the try exception?
Yeah, can I ask
Oh,
something
sorry, yeah, I
really
saw your
quick?
hand. What's up?
Do you mind just scrolling up to the top? I feel like I'm missing something at the top of your file. I'll just like take a screen cap. Thank you.
Yep. Okay. So this is fine. This pattern I've showed you, this is reliable, but in Python, there are often more elegant ways of doing things. If there's something that you type hundreds and hundreds of times, Python will often have an elegant solution for it. And this is one of those situations where there's a Python specific syntax we can use that'll make it a little bit easier to write this code.
Now connected to desktop EP5 SK6.
Sorry, Alexa's freaking out for some reason. So you might notice that there's like some repetitive code here that we have to write a lot. Like I'm going to have to write connection.commit every time I want to actually save data. If I forget to do that, then my data doesn't get saved. I need to remember to call connection.rollback. It's not enough that we throw an error. I have to call connection.rollback in the error handler here. And then I've got to remember to close the connection when I'm done with it, because otherwise I'm going to keep accumulating open connections to the database and it's going to crash eventually. So there's a few different things here I have to remember, or else bad stuff happens if I forget. So I'm going to look for some way to do these automatically. So has anyone seen the with keyword in Python?
Yeah, we used it when we were doing our CSV things, like with open or whatever.
Mm-hmm. So can you tell me what it does? No is an acceptable answer.
I'm gonna go with no on this one.
Okay. So the with keyword is definitely something I see people throw around a lot without really understanding, because it definitely makes some things easier to write. But there is a fair amount going on under the hood with this with keyword. So I'm going to put it this way. In Python, some objects are also called context managers. This is like another role they can perform, which means that they have certain methods defined on them. So I could do a brief demo, just creating a context manager and showing how to use it. I'm not sure if that would be necessary or useful, but the point I'm trying to make here is that for some objects in Python, you can define extra functionality for them, how you can define how they work with the with keyword. If something is defined as a context manager, you can use it with. So for example, you've seen like open filename.csv. When you call open, the object that this returns is a context manager. It has the methods enter and exit defined on it. And because it has those methods, you can use the with keyword on it. Something like that is a syntax you've seen. So this is doing a whole lot of work for you automatically. So like the enter method is saying like, we want to open this file and might set some other default settings that you need to read the CSV file. But more importantly is the exit method, will automatically close the CSV file when you exit the with block. So, you would indent. And then afterwards, you unindent. So this is the convenience that you get from using with, because the open method is specifically designed to work with the with keyword. When you exit this block, so just when we unindent after this with block, Python will automatically call this exit method, which closes the CSV file. So we're going to find some similar things working with Psycopg here, in that this connection object is also a context manager. It also has these enter and exit methods. So we can call it using with to automatically manage some of these aspects of our transactions. So I'm going to create a new file where we can check that out. We're not going to need a try catch block here anymore. Not going to need these commit statements. Okay, so I've refactored the exact same code to now work with the with statement. And so this should look pretty similar to, kind of the code that we use to interact with the CSV files. So I use with, saying that we are entering a context here. Psycopg.connect returns a connection object, which supports the enter and exit methods. So it is a context manager. And then indented inside of this with block, I can use this connection. But so like before, a new transaction is started at the beginning of the with block. But then at the end of it, so I never call connection.commit. If we successfully exit the with block without throwing any errors, Psycopg will automatically commit this transaction. Now, if an error is thrown, like this raise exception, oops, or there's a constraint that's violated, like negative account balance. If an exception is thrown, then Psycopg will automatically roll back the transaction. And then lastly, if we exit the with block for any reason, either it was successful or there was an error, the connection is closed. So you also don't see that here. Let me just make sure that still works. Yeah, so again, code runs exactly the same. We get the same output. It's able to make that transfer. But in theory, this is a cleaner, more elegant way to write your code. You don't have to remember all those little bits and pieces. There are fewer mistakes you can potentially make because you just don't have to remember to close the connection or commit your transaction. You just know that all the statements inside of the with block are grouped together. And then, after the with block, they all get saved. If there's an error in the with block, nothing in that with block actually takes effect. So I think this is a preferable way to work with Psycopg. Once you get into the rhythm of it and you know how it works and you just want your code to look clean and simple, I think this is a common way that people will write it. Do we have any questions about this? Context managers or with?
Yeah. Could you please
Yep.
just shoot an error so we could see it processing that and how it stays the same and such?
Let's see. So this is going to prevent us from doing the query here. But then if I look at it from P-SQL, yeah, it goes back to 7525, because in this case, all of the code, all of the queries are in the same transaction. So I guess that's one difference between this version and the previous version. Previously, we were committing halfway through, and now we're no longer doing that because the with block is managing our transaction automatically. So if I wanted to commit halfway through, I would have to use a second with block. I guess I can show you that if you want to see it. Okay, so now this with block will end, the one that just creates the accounts. And so then after that, we should be committing the transaction. And then this second with block will start, which should throw an error here, or throw an error here, then undo this transaction, undo this query, and leave us with just $100 and $0. So yeah, we got the oops error. And still did not work right. I think the program might have stopped executing, and then we never actually got to the second with block. Do I have to wrap the with block in try catch actually? Wait. Actually, hang on a second. Actually, I'm not sure what's going on here. So we've got auto commit false. We exit the with block, should be committing my account with 100, your account with 0. not I was expecting. Shouldn't need to call function.commit here.
It's not zero.
Yeah, so it looks like I do still need to call commit manually, but it does close the connection automatically. Because like if I just call, connection dot execute or students, like this is going to fail outside of the with block because the connection is closed at this point. Yeah, error, the connection is closed because at the end of this with block, it automatically closed the connection. So that's why here I had to open another connection for my second with block.
So is it not committing at the end of the with block, but it will commit at the end of all code with the with block? Like at the end of your of all your code?
I guess it commits implicitly when it gets to the end of the file, but I was really expecting that to happen at the end of the with block. Hang on a second. Yeah, I mean, this is straight from the docs. Psycopg 3 connection uses context manager. When the block is exited, if there's a transaction open, it'll be committed. An exception is raised, it'll be rolled back. In both cases, the connection is closed. Just different from Psycopg 2. So doesn't seem like it's working as described right now. I might have to dig into this a little bit more. Sorry about that. I mean, generally speaking, like I prefer honestly writing the try except code just because I think it's more explicit and I just trust it more that I know what it's doing. I know these with statements are very popular in Python, but I kind of don't like how much like magic is happening under the hood here. So yeah, just like you were saying, it says in the docs that it should be automatically committing at the end of the with block, but it seems like that's not what's happening here. Actually, I'm gonna take off auto commit and let it just default. Just wondering if I maybe should not be monkeying with that. Let's take out the connection commit. Okay, yeah, it seemed like setting auto commit to false was overriding some settings of like using with. So I just took that off using the default settings. And now it looks like it's working the way the docs described. Again, I was only using auto commit just to make some points in the demo. You probably don't need to think about that if you're using transactions in the conventional way. You just leave it out entirely. So now we're seeing that these queries are committing. We're setting my account and your account 100 and 0. That gets committed at the end of this with block. And then in the second with block, it's getting rolled back. So this statement is never run. We don't end up like losing any money. So let me just run that again, just for my sanity. Yeah, okay. So I think that was the issue. I just didn't need to have anything set for auto commit.
Thank you.
Yep. Does anyone have any other questions about context managers or with? If we want, I could do a quick demo just showing how to make them, what they do, but it's probably not essential. Yes, no, nobody cares.
Well, the only question I had was, what do we need to worry about the auto commit then?
I would say no, like don't really think about it because honestly, you should always be using transactions. So that's the default behavior. if you don't set auto commit is that it'll create a transaction for you when you execute a query, and then you have to commit it manually. That's, I think, a solid, reliable way of using SQL, just always running things within transactions to make sure you don't get into like an invalid or inconsistent state. So yeah, I just wouldn't worry too much about auto commit. Also, very quickly, we're going to start interacting with Postgres from Django, not just like directly through Psycopg here. So you're not going to have to worry too much about like making this comfortable and convenient for you. Like, you're not going to have to optimize this workflow. I just want you to understand these concepts. But pretty soon, when we get to Django, there's going to be an even more sophisticated way that we interact with our data.
All right, thanks.
Yeah. Roki?
Hi, Raphael. If you don't mind, can you please like comment out line 33 and 37 and just run it one last time so we can confirm that like the auto commit didn't have an impact on the code?
Okay.
Just to make sure it's in the database as we expect.
Yeah, so this should actually perform the transfer successfully. We'll end up with 75 and 25. Yeah, there we go. And then just for my sanity, yeah.
Mine too. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. All right, no more questions about with or context managers or this style. All right, why don't we take a 15-minute break? And then when we come back, I'm going to talk a little bit about reading CSV files some more.
Hey, Raf, before we move on to the next thing, I have a quick question about the previous thing.
Yep.
How would you know if something is a context manager and that you could use with it? Is that just reading the docs, I guess?
Yeah, reading the docs. I can't imagine any other way I would know that. Actually, let me think about something for a second. Okay, so I just did print dir on the connection object. So just to see what keys exist on this object. And just looking through it, I can see that it has enter and exit. So these dunder methods are the hallmark of a context manager. So I guess in that way, I could determine it. I'm not sure if I would do that practically, like just print dir on all these various objects to see if they have these methods. More commonly, I would just look in the documentation, and if a particular object is intended to be used as a context manager, I'm sure the docs would be very proud of that, and they would show you how to use it with. Probably code snippets you find online, I expect would be mostly using that syntax, because I think when it's available to you, Python developers tend to prefer that.
Cool, thank you.
Yep. All righty. So we're gonna close out the morning with a little bit more CSV work. So I've opened a file here called csvexample.py. Now we're gonna create a new database also for this example. This demo is going to be about real estate prices, which I guess I already have that database, so we're not going to worry about that. Let's see. Before I start writing code to read a CSV, I should actually have a CSV file. So this is linked from the curriculum, just a CSV file with Sacramento real estate data. Just copy that guy. Paste them over there. Okay. So I've got all my Sacramento real estate data, my CSV or my Python file. First, we're going to import CSV because this is what I'll be using to interact with the actual CSV file. I'll import Psycopg because we're going to be inserting data into our database from the CSV file. But before we think too hard about how we're going to actually insert the data, let's just take a look at it first. Here's that with keyword again. So we enter our context. Want to get the CSV in a dictionary. It's a pretty convenient format. And we want to loop through the rows. But I don't really know what I want to do with them yet. I just know I want to look at them all, see what we can see. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to actually set a breakpoint here in my editor. I just click this little red dot, set a breakpoint here inside of this loop. And then we're going to run with the debugger. I'm going to start debugging in the run menu. I want to debug this Python file. Okay, so it opens the CSV file, and now it reads it into a dictionary, and we're prepared to loop through the rows, but it's paused on this breakpoint here. So now I can see what my data looks like a little bit better. So we already saw it in the CSV file, but now we've got it loaded up in Python. And if I want to look at the next row, I can just step over. Now this person's at 51 Omaha Court, step through. This person's 2796 Branch Street. So we can see a few examples of what our data looks like in Python before we try to insert it into our database. Does anyone see any problems with our data here? Coming straight out of our CSV? Andrew?
It's all string.
It's all strings. It's like that breakfast cereal, oops, all strings or whatever. I don't know. But yeah, all of our data are strings because when we're reading from the CSV, there's no way to tell if a number is supposed to be a string or a number. It just assumes everything is a string. And for some of these, that's really inappropriate. So like beds and baths, those should be numbers. So we can see if it has, more than 2 beds. Square foot should be a number, so we can do mathematical comparisons with that. Price, latitude and longitude should probably be numbers. Zip code is fine as a string though. But yeah, so this is a problem. And this is generally like the problem when you're reading CSVs to put into a database, that your data is not going to be in the exact format you need it in. We're going to have to convert some of these strings to numbers. We would like to convert this date string into a date object. That's much more flexible, much more useful in Python. And we're not going to do this today, but in a more practical situation, you would probably also have users that just are really sloppy or don't know what they're doing, and they just type in invalid data. So you'd have to have some way to automatically fix things when possible. So yeah, that's about all we can see here with the debugger. Just want to look at our data real quick. So I'm going to stop debugging here. So we're going to create a new table here for all of our properties where we're going to store this data. This is going to be a bigger table, so you don't need to watch me type it out. I'm just going to copy paste this from the curriculum. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to declare a little helper function that's going to help me with cleaning this data. So I've seen what all the individual rows look like just now in my debugger. So I'm going to write a function that takes in one row. And then it's going to return a dictionary that has clean data instead of, the original dirty data we got from our CSV file. Define a dictionary, and then just say what all the properties should be. Some of these we're just going to transfer over as is. Although I'm going to take the opportunity to change the name. So the CSV file has a heading called, or I'm sorry, the CSV file has a heading called street. So we saw that here, the first column has the heading street. But in our data, in our database, we're going to call it street address. So I'm taking this opportunity to rename the column, even though the data itself is correct. I'm going to do this a few more times for some similar pieces of data. Again, you don't need to watch me type all this out. But you'll notice that for some of these, we had to do a little bit more work. Hang on a second. So these are built-in modules in Python, but I'm going to be using these to help me convert my data. So for some of these, like number of beds and baths, square footage, so we want those to be integers. Specifically, it doesn't help us to have those as strings in our database. So I'm just using the built-in int to convert these to integers. For latitude and longitude, it's important that we maintain a certain amount of decimal precision, and we don't want that to get like rounded randomly or whatever by Python. So we're using this special type decimal that's going to be a little bit more precise with our decimal places than just the regular Python float type. And then maybe the weirdest thing here, we're using date time dot, I'm not really sure how to pronounce this, string parse time. People disagree about what the P is supposed to stand for. But this method is used to convert a date string into a date object. So here we're passing in the date string, just CSV row sale date. That's just one of these. Oh, sorry, one of these. Just the three numbers separated by slashes. And then here, as the second argument, we pass in a format string that tells Python how the string should be turned into a date. We're saying that, so these are all placeholders here, %m, %d, %y. We're saying that in the string that we just passed in, first it starts with the month, then there's a slash character, then there's the day, then there's a slash character, and then there's the year. So given that we told date time dot string time what the format of our date string is, it's able to convert that into a date object. So I don't expect you to remember what these placeholders are. I certainly don't. I look them up every time I do this. There's a handful of them. Let's see what we can find here. Okay, docs aren't quite as easy to search as I was hoping. Yeah, it's referring to the format codes here. That's what I'm looking for. Can't find the actual docs for them. Well, here's another example though. So some different placeholders like %A, %D lets you like print out the day of the week. Or you want to get the month as like a word instead of a number. Oh, I guess this is converting from the date object to the string. So that's in the opposite direction.
On your table of contents there, see where it's got format codes kind of highlighted.
Is it? Am I
Will that
dumb?
take you to this? Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Okay, thank you so much. I'm just like dumb and wasn't reading the sidebar. It was totally right there, trying to tell me what I needed, and I just didn't see it. So these are all those little placeholders that you can use. So in our example, we just had month, day of the month, and then the year. Where's the year? Year. So these are not exactly alphabetical, seems like. Curious. But yeah, so however you need to format a date as a string, you don't have to like do that manually, like convert the numbers into the days of the week, and like you don't have to maintain your own array of days of the week and months of the year to do these conversions or whatever from numbers to strings. This is built-in functionality in Python, and I'd recommend you get some familiarity with this. You should be able to work with dates, generally convert them back and forth from strings, preserve time zone if need be. Because working with dates, I would say, is one of the more complex parts of being a web developer. Generally speaking, at the companies I've worked at recently, when there's been some like show-stopping bug that takes a service offline and like crashes things and we need to get all hands on deck to fix it, it's usually someone who didn't understand how dates work, like writing buggy code. So I don't know, they're definitely a common source of problems. So I'm going to encourage you to, spend some time playing with dates in your code. All right, but back to CSVs. So I've got this helper function now, which should take in an individual CSV row and then return a new row that just has my data cleaned up in a format that I think is appropriate for my database. So now I'm going to actually connect to the database.
Hey, Raphael, before you get too far from it, can I ask a question, please?
Go for it.
So what this clean data CSV row function that you just called, it's pulling everything that's going to come out of the CSV into this clean dictionary. And then you're saying the clean dictionary where it's street address, I want you to change it from street address to just the word street. So like
other way
the
around.
becomes street.
You got that backwards. So in the CSV file, the heading is called street. In our database, we're going to call it street address.
Oh, so I think the function on top is the CSV function, right? I'm trying to see where it got how it's pulling the data and how it's relabeling.
So previously I was reading the CSV file just with this quick little with open, and then in the debugger, I was checking out the rows.
Never mind. I got it.
Cool.
So how's it getting I forgot that we named it CSV file up here. And then that's why you can reference it down there. But how is it setting up this clean then? So the clean is just creating a whole new row. Clean. Oh, okay, so street address is the key, and then it's all right. Oh, got it. Thank you.
Cool, cool. So now we've got some helpers defined. We're going to actually connect to our database and insert some data. Run that query. And then open a context for our CSV file. So similar code I had before, we're just opening the CSV file, looping through it. Passing each row into our clean data helper function. That's going to assign that to a variable. And then I will execute a query in which we insert that data into the database. This is going to be a pretty long query just because of how many individual fields there are in our CSV, and therefore how many fields there are in our table. So again, I'm just going to copy this from the curriculum. So yeah, this is.
Can we reformat that in any way? So it doesn't have to be on all one line like that?
It doesn't. This is how it was in the curriculum. So I just copied it over, but I'm going to fix that up real quick, I think.
Yeah, stuff like, I don't know why that just drives me crazy.
Is that how I'd write this? Something like that. Oh, and we probably want to break this up into multiple lines. Or, I'm not exactly sure how I'd want to format this. I could put each of these on their own line, but I'm not actually sure if that would improve readability, because then this would just be like 2 pages long for just all these columns.
It might be longer, but I would like it like that, just because like when you're scrolling down, you can quickly see the properties and then you see the clean data. It's just reading it linearly like that would help me personally. But like you're saying, it's probably just like a preference kind of thing.
So something like that, kind of how I'd format. But anyway, you can see now that since here we're using the positional parameters instead of the named parameters, this is a lot harder to read because we've got like 11 of these %S's. In this case, it's just, a series of insertions. But if it was like a more complicated query where we were reusing these values in different places, this would be even much harder to read than it is currently. So I hope you can see why I don't particularly prefer this syntax. And I would have found this easier to read using named parameters, but this is also perfectly valid. And lastly, I'm gonna have to connection.commit and connection.close, because this file is not using the context manager for the database, only using context management for the CSV file. So if I've done everything correctly, this should insert a bunch of cleaned data into my database. Okay, no errors. So that should have inserted into the Sacramento real estate database. So I'm going to connect to, let me just make sure. Yeah, okay, so I did \L to list my databases. So I'm going to use \C to connect to Sacramento real estate. Now connected to Sacramento real estate as Rafael Sirota. Okay, so we've just got the one table for properties. We'll select star from properties. And it looks like I have, well, actually it doesn't look like much of anything. It's kind of hard to read this data just because the output is wider than my terminal. So the columns are getting messed up a little bit. So let's format this slightly differently. Select star from properties. I'm going to use this little trick I might have mentioned before, \GX. It just makes the data output vertically instead of in a table. So for very large output, this is an easier way to read it, in my opinion. But here it does look like, we've inserted our data successfully. It's hard to tell here just the difference between numbers and strings. But just remember, when I created my table, I defined, number of beds, number of baths as integers. And so the fact that I'm able to insert it without throwing any errors means that we've got our data in as the correct types. And I can scroll down. It looks like I've got all of our users in here. Everyone's got the data that I expect they should have. So that's cool. Yeah. But yeah, so that's kind of a brief run through of how you might fix up CSV data before you insert it into your database. This is something I've been asked to do professionally at least like two or three times. I want to say it's not a super uncommon thing to be asked for, because non-technical people work in Excel, they export their data to CSVs, and then if you want to use their Excel data in your application, this is one way you can get it in there.
Could you use Python to write a script so if they drop the CSV file to a folder, you can like trigger a script to run to automatically take that data from the CSV and inject it into a database or something like that.
Could you say that one more time?
Yeah, so what if, I'm just thinking like an automated process, we would create a script. So like whenever a new CSV, say, like you're saying, you have less technical people, they're managing CSV files, but it would trigger a script to run anytime they drop the new file into a folder. Something like that.
Yeah, there are ways you can do that. I would wonder like who is noticing that you dropped a script into the folder? Because like you can run another script that watches for changes in a folder, but we were talking about non-technical people doing this. So I'm kind of
I just meant like they would have access to the folder, but that means they could just like basically they just work in their CSV file and they're done, and say they needed to merge that data with the database, they could just like drop their data or their file into the folder and not have to really worry about it. And then
I mean, like I guess you could have a folder full of CSV files, and then you can have your Django application when it starts up just read all of the CSV files and then dump them into the database. You'd probably want to have some way of keeping track of which ones you've already inserted though, so you don't like, duplicate your data every time the server restarts.
Yeah.
But yeah, if that's what you're trying to achieve, it's just a moderate engineering effort. You could get it done.
Okay.
All right, any other questions on anything we've covered today? You're gonna have some homework for tonight. It's gonna be pretty similar to this last bit about CSV cleaning. Instead of Sacramento real estate, you're gonna be working with Chicago salaries. But similar, we're gonna tell you to download a CSV file. It's from this City of Chicago website, I guess. Yeah, cityofchicago.org. Just click through. There's this export button here. You can get it in CSV format. I don't know what the difference is in CSV for Excel, but plain CSV seems to work just fine. And then, yeah, you're going to make a database, clean some data, insert it, and then run some queries on it just to confirm that you've inserted the data in a correct and useful way that enables flexible querying. All right, any last questions before we break for today?
I have one question, because I was trying to see on our documentation that we're going to be looking at if about doing the /c. So we need to do the /c if we're going to connect to it on the outside in order to look at the database.
/c is how you connect to a different database once you're already inside of pSQL.
Okay, so it's just a separate thing altogether if you want to work with pSQL inside the database prompt.
Yeah. So all these / commands, /q to quit, /c to change database, these are not Postgres commands or like SQL commands, but these are specific to pSQL. This command line program that I'm using to access my database, they only work here. But so here, given that I've already connected to class roster, like I could just, /q to quit out and then pSQL. Wait, students. I mean, I guess I could pSQL Postgres. I'm trying to remember the name of my other databases here. So yeah, I can just quit out and then connect to another one. But if you just want to skip a step, you can just use /c. So yeah, /c school. So without exiting from pSQL, I'm able to switch to different databases. This isn't like super useful, honestly, because for the most part, you're going to be working in one database for an extended period of time on whatever project you're working on. But for the purpose of this demo, as I'm jumping around between a few different databases, it's kind of useful, I guess.
Thanks.
Yep. Any other questions? Question. Everybody feel like we have a pretty good handle on all the stuff we learned today? Feel good about like transactions and parameters? Really, if you remember only one thing from today, I hope you just remember how transactions work and just understand that they're important. I guess in my opinion, I think transactions are vitally important. Like you cannot responsibly build a web application that takes people's money unless you're using transactions in your database. There's just too many ways that like errors can randomly happen that are outside of your control. And if it's in the middle of some sequence of database commands, some user in your system is going to lose their data. And it's either like they're losing work that they did in your application, or possibly like you're losing their money. Like they bought something through your app that they no longer have access to, or you're like, if you're doing a financial technology application, you might actually just mistakenly drop money from their account, like you saw, here with the transaction where we throw an error here. So we do teach you a lot of stuff about SQL. I feel like some of these things are kind of like nice to haves, like some of the advanced aggregation things, all the group by statements. Like I use those kind of infrequently. You can probably get by without knowing those like the back of your hand. You just look them up when you need them. But transactions are vitally important. You just like cannot responsibly build an application without transactions. And if you build an application without them and try to add them on later, you're going to have a very tough time. So I would strongly recommend that, if you're building a serious application that your income depends on, you should build it from the start using transactions.
Can you walk us through the account transactions file again, like briefly?
Yep.
Since we don't have time.
So first I am connecting to my database. Database name is class roster. Not going to auto commit, so I have to actually manually manage my transactions. And then that gives me a connection object, which I can use for further queries. So just to make sure I'm starting off fresh every time I run this script, I'm going to drop the accounts table so I can recreate it in this script. Here's the query to create it, just a table named accounts. It's got the ID, which is just going to be a serial integer. And then account name is a string, and then the balance, how much money you got, it's going to be an integer because you can't store pennies for some reason in this application, I decided. Execute the query, which creates the table. And now I'm going to get ready to create some accounts just to show off the parameters. I'm declaring these as separate variables. And then we interpolate them using the %s, which is just how Psycopg asks you to declare placeholders for your values. So after declaring the placeholders, I pass in this dictionary, which has the values for those placeholders. So this account name placeholder, that's account name, which is just my account. And this balance placeholder just goes to balance, which is this guy over here, value of 100. We do a pretty similar thing again, creating a second account. Just to confirm that everything works correctly so far, I do a query to fetch all the accounts, just select star from accounts, save the results in a variable. But we have to then tell Psycopg how we want to view those results. I don't want to get them row by row. I want to see all of them at once. So I do fetch all to just get me all of the results from that selection. And then I commit what I've done so far. So I want to save this account creation so that if I have to roll back a transaction later on this file, at least this work is saved, but the other stuff that comes later might get undone. So we're going to try to execute decrementing $25 from my account. And then before we add the 25 to your account, we're raising an error here. Now, practically, this exception would come from some other source, maybe like an actual legitimate, honest Python bug that someone wrote, or possibly from a database constraint being violated. They try to insert a string into a number column, or they're missing required data or something, or negative account balance when it has to be positive. So something would throw an error here, which would prevent the rest of this try block from finishing. So we don't get to commit. And then instead we go to this except block, which if we get into this except block, we're kind of assuming that something went wrong with our query. We don't want to try to commit it because some of our statements did not get run, but not all of them. So we roll it back inside the except block. And then after the try except, I just want to see one more time what the result of my database is. And regardless of whether we were successful or we failed, we close the connection. Sound good?
Will we still be doing that with the with block?
If you're using the with block, you no longer need to manually call connection.commit. You should not need to manually call connection.rollback. That'll automatically happen if there's an error encountered. And you do not need to call connection.close, because that also automatically happens when you exit the with block.
Thanks.
Yep. You know what? I'm gonna spend one more minute, literal minute. People were asking about Uuids yesterday. Figure I could just show that off real quick. So there is a module built into Python called Uuid, which stands for Universally Unique Identifier. So like the name would imply, these are universally unique. I can generate an ID on my computer and someone else on the other side of the world can generate an ID on their computer, or we can just both be generating, as many of these as we can as fast as our computer will let us. And the two of us will never generate a duplicate Uuid. Right. Let me just go with this real quick. Okay, import Uuid. There are multiple versions of Uuid. V4 is commonly used today. Excuse me.
You have to rename your file, Raf.
Yeah. In the wrong folder.
So now you got to call it by UID test instead of UID by.
Oh my gosh, you're right. Sorry, I'm just getting tripped up over dumb stuff here. Okay, there we go. That was all I was trying to show you here. I can import Uuid, generate an ID number, the fourth version of the Uuid, And it gives me something like this. There's like 4 or 5 sections here separated by dashes. Important things to know is that this number incorporates the current time. So if I'm generating a whole bunch of these, just because no 2 of them are generated at the exact same microsecond, they're always going to have like some different like inputs to them. And it also uses information from your system, I believe. So even if 2 computers are generating UUIDs at the exact same time, there's no way that they'll generate the same UUID. And that's the whole point. We want to make sure that these are universally unique. So for the most part, like serial integer IDs are fine. And I'll say it's perfectly fine if you use them for the rest of this cohort. You don't need to use UUIDs. But practically speaking, there are reasons why people use these. So for one thing, some people think there's a security issue with using integer IDs, because that way users can guess other IDs in your system. So like if I log into a website and I see in the inspector that it sends a request to like my data /11, like I'm going to assume that I'm user number 11. Maybe I can try sending a request to my data /12, and then I can get someone else's data instead. Like a poorly designed web application might have a vulnerability like that. And so having sequential IDs kind of lets the hackers skip a step, because they can guess other users' IDs. If you're using these kinds of UUIDs, there's no way for a hacker to guess another user's ID based on any ID in the system, even if they know their own ID. The other advantage of using UUIDs is that because they're universally unique, you can have IDs that are generated on multiple systems and then still feed into the same database. So let's say I had 2 different web applications. They both let users sign up to them, but I need to store all the users from both of those applications in one database. If both of those applications are using serial IDs that start at 1, then like they're going to come up with duplicate IDs. However, if both of those applications are using UUIDs, then there's no way that they're going to accidentally create users with the same ID. And so I could safely take all of those users and insert them into another database. So that was actually a problem I had to solve at a job a few companies ago. Just there were 2 different applications that needed to share a database. And so we had to migrate all the IDs over to UUIDs just so we could generate them from any system and guarantee that there wouldn't be duplicate IDs.
It's okay just to naturally use UUIDs, even if you don't think you're going to come into that, just as a nice way to generate unique IDs versus it just being.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Is it just a good practice thing to say utilize UUIDs anyway?
I would say it's a good practice. Most of the jobs I've had recently have used UUIDs instead of serial IDs. They have, a handful of small benefits. And the only real downside is that it's a little bit more effort to get it set up, but it's only more effort like the first time when you get it set up. Just because you can't rely on the serial ID every time you insert a user, you have to generate a UUID and then specify that as their ID. So there's like, an extra step or 2 you have to do. But once you've got the pattern in place, it's not really any extra work. So like for you just doing your assignments here, I'm not going to insist you do this, just make things a little bit easier for you. You can use serial IDs if that makes it easier to reason about. It also makes it easier to read your data. Like I'm using P-SQL School. What? So if I'm just like looking at my data with P-SQL, it is kind of nice just to see ID 1, 2, 3. Like if I'm scrolling through pages and pages of data, it helps me kind of keep oriented at like where I'm at. And just generally, I know that, users with higher IDs were inserted later than users with lower number IDs. So as you're just like learning and developing and debugging, you might find it easier to use the numeric IDs, but certainly for like professional or practical purposes, I would always use a UUID because it's only a small amount of extra effort and it solves a couple of practical problems. Do we have any other questions? Last minute questions before we break for lunch. Questions going once, going twice.
Yeah, I do have a question.
Okay.
I'm just wondering, do we have like an updated date on when we might expect our assessment twos back if we haven't gotten it yet?
Yeah, I'm sorry, there have been some delays in the back office. We're still working on that. Thanks for your patience.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Hey, Raphael, is that a GoldenEye map as your background?
In Zune? No, so this is from Risk of Rain. It's a PC roguelite, or I guess it's on a lot of platforms. Yeah, it's a roguelite. You crash land on an alien planet, kill a bunch of aliens, get a bunch of treasure, try to get home. This is one of the snowy maps called Rally Point Delta. I think there are a few other people in the class saying they play it. It's something I've been having fun with recently.
Oh,
Yeah, I'm glad we've got some interest in games here. This might be more of a stand down topic though. So gonna come back to some fun gamer chat later on.
Space colonization.
Returns for stand down and then gets caught up in an hour-long run.
Yeah, I'm not gonna make you watch me play that during stand down. That would probably go over. So any other questions before we break for the afternoon? Nothing. All right. So yeah, let's go to lunch, come back at like 1:10. I'm gonna open up breakout rooms for pair programming and Slack out y'all's partners. Again, if there's repeats, feel free to reorganize yourself. You know, also someone's gonna be in a group of 3 probably, but also just let me know if you're unable to do pair programming or, you know, all the usual stuff.